All right, well, welcome to the School of Sustainability Research Seminar. I'm a faculty member at the School of Sustainability. My name is Tyler DeRoche, and I'm honored to present today somebody who's visiting us for an entire year from the University of Purdue, Taylor Davis. Taylor's a friend and collaborator of mine. So Taylor's background is largely philosophy of cognitive science and philosophy of mind, but he's really taken a deep dive into norms, sustainability. And so a lot of the work that he'll be discussing today will be on that topic. He's published in places like Nature Sustainability, Sustainability Science, and Ecology and Society. And so he's one of these rare birds, even though his background's in philosophy, he's very much empirical and engaged with a lot of empirical work. So hopefully his work here will be of great interest to you today. All right, Taylor.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks to Tyler and Jenny for the invitation. I'm really excited to be able to present this work to you guys and to be able to do it, so to speak, right up front, right as I'm getting here for a year, so that folks, at least if you've got things to say or if you have comments on it, I really want to know what people think about this. So I'm really looking forward to getting feedback. As Tyler said, or I guess picking up where Tyler left off, I think really the way you should look at me here is as a kind of theoretical psychologist. You might not have heard of that because I don't know if it exists in the real world, but my undergrad degree was in psych. And then I got out of psych to go into philosophy, but kind of what I've mostly been doing in philosophy is just the pure theory of psychology. In psychology itself, they don't really want people doing pure theory. They're very observation driven. That's what I wanted to do, is the real zoom out picture, like, but how does this all fit together? So that's really what I'm doing here. Think of it as like theoretical psychology. And specifically looking at norms and norms of sustainability. So I guess I should add to what Tyler said. My background was in the evolution of morality and religion originally. My dissertation was on cultural evolutionary theories of religion. But in that work, I was looking a lot at norms and cooperation, because that's really what's driving the evolution of morality and religion. And then I got hired at Purdue to take that background, basically, of working on cooperation and norms from that sort of religion morality perspective and apply it to sustainability and apply it to norms of sustainability. So that's what I've been doing the last 8 years or so since I got to Purdue. And the basic angle here is just that, I mean, if you look at what the sustainability movement, let's call it, is, it's fundamentally a normative movement. That's to say, it's a change in values. What's changing is that people in culture care more about something that they didn't used to care that much about. But they don't just care subjectively, as in I like it. They care objectively, as in that's right or wrong. That's what I mean by normative. And that's what's happening when I'm invoking norms here. Norms are the rights and wrongs of a culture, the oughts, the things you ought to do or ought not to do. With regard to sustainability, what's going on is that norms of sustainability are taking hold. I mean, the way to put it from my perspective, with my background, is that there are these norms where people are now valuing the long-term future in a way they never used to. And what it amounts to is the position that it's wrong to sell out the future. I mean, it's wrong to exploit the future. And you can put that in a few different, more specific terms, of course. You can say it's wrong to exploit the human beings of the future. But you might say it's wrong to exploit, I don't know, the planet of the future or certain ecosystems of the future or whatever. I mean, you can, what it is exactly about the future is still open. But what I take it sustainability, what all sustainability views have in common is this kind of normative view that the wrong thing to do is to forget about the future and just go hard at the present right now and get all your goodies now and forget about the future. That's the point. And so then what we're looking at, so to speak, naturalistically in the physical world is how does that value get, I mean, I'm not interested in that value, you know, as far as whether it's really true or in some Platonic realm. I'm interested in how do we get that value into heads? I'm interested in the practical question, the psychological question of how do you get people to actually think that way, whether, frankly, whether it's true or not. Hopefully, you know, hopefully it's true, I guess, or the ethicists are the kind of philosophers who would talk about whether this is really the right thing to do. I'm just assuming that it's the right thing to do. And my question is, if that's the right thing to do, how do we actually do it? And that puts us squarely into the domain of norm psychology. So what we're doing is we're looking at normative values, getting into minds, what is the psychology of normative value? How does that work? And that's really the background, that's my background, is psychology of norms in general. How do people think about rights and wrongs? How does that work at the population level? What are the consequences at the population level? And then now I'm just applying all that to sustainability and looking specifically at norms that say that it's wrong to sell out the future. So the basic goal from my perspective, from a psychological perspective here, the basic goal of sort of the whole movement is find the motivations that get people to behave in sustainable ways and turn up the dial. Find as many of them as you can find and turn up the dial on all of them as fast as you can, basically, ASAP. I mean, the basic idea is we need to change as much behavior as we can, as fast as we can, and just change the way people are valuing the future. So I take that to be the goal, and this is, I suppose, my analysis of the goal. What I'm trying to do, or what at least I think we are trying to do, many of us. So, and if that's what you're trying to do, just maximize motivations for sustainability wherever you can find them, wherever you can get them. And if what those motivations are is motivations about right and wrong, normative motivations, the idea that it's wrong to behave in a certain way, then basically there are just two categories of motivation for that kind of thing, for following norms. I mean, the point is it's a norm, it's wrong to do this, and there are two kinds of motivations for following norms. There are instrumental motivations, where what's happening is you're following the norm as an instrumental means to gain some other end or goal. Usually what's happening is what a norm means is that somebody's going to punish you if you violate the norm. The norm says X is wrong, so if you do X, you're going to get punishment. Instrumental motivation is then just avoiding punishment. I don't want to break the rules, so I'm going to follow the rule, but not because I care about what's right or wrong. I'm just trying not to get punished. I just don't want to get a speeding ticket, so I'm not going to go too fast. I don't care about putting other people in danger or anything. I just don't want a ticket. That's instrumental motivation. And a lot of norm following is based on this. I mean, it's all over the place. The other, though, basic category is not instrumental. It's where what's motivating you is the wrongness itself, so to speak, or the rightness itself. So intrinsic motivations to follow norms are motivations where you have classified the thing cognitively as wrong, and now you just don't want to do it, and you don't want other people to do it. Or you've classified the thing as right, and now you do want to do it. You're motivated by the rightness and wrongness itself, regardless of consequences. You're not worried about what other people are going to do. That's not intrinsic motivation. That's the instrumental motivation. So basically, we just have these two different types of motivation. Now, you can break these large categories into subcategories. In particular, the instrumental one breaks down into a lot of subcategories. The intrinsic one doesn't, actually. And that's the one I'm going to focus on, how to sort of channel that. If you've got these two basic motivations, and if what you're trying to do is just crank up the dial on each of them, then basically I think this, to me, the simplest way to look at this is you've got two strategies that you can take, two general types of strategy. There's the instrumentalist strategy, where the point is you're just going to target instrumental motivations. You know that people follow norms of sustainability out of instrumental motivation, and those are the ones you're going to target and focus on. If that's what you're doing, then the way to do it, what you're doing is basically just applying rewards and punishments. If you're using the instrumentalist strategy, then what you're really just doing is using rewards and punishments to make it instrumentally valuable for people to follow the norms. You're just making it easy for them, or not hard, or you're making it hard for them not to follow the norm, would be another way to put it. So that's the strategy that goes with that kind of motivation. And then, of course, you can do the same with the other type of motivation. If you've got intrinsic motivations, psychologically a very different way of following a norm, there's another whole strategy that targets those motivations, which would be to say, all right, well, let's take that type of motivation where you're really worried about what's right or wrong, and let's make that, let's just turn up the dial on that, and target those. And when you're doing that, what you're doing is actually really quite different. It's not just applying rewards and punishments. It does involve some rewarding and punishing, but it's a really different thing. It's a cultural learning process, I guess is the way I would put it, to kind of encapsulate it all in one go. But it's not just applying rewards and punishments like the instrumentalist strategy is. So the basic idea here is that if what we're going to do is try to maximize sustainable behavior, maximize sustainable motivation, I'm starting from, okay, well then let's dive into the mind and work our way outward. How would we do that? And when you do it from that perspective, what you get is dive into the mind. Well, there are two basic ways to do it. Now, going out from there, what do those two ways look like? The point is to access these different sources of motivation, which are functionally different, you need different interventions. You need to do different things to turn up the dial on these two different types of motivation. Also, importantly, I'm worried that we're only doing one of them. At the moment, it seems to me that there's a lot of instrumentalist strategy going on and not very much internalization strategy happening. So what I think we need to do is pursue both of these strategies as hard as we can. And I'm worried that we're only doing one of them, and maybe not even the best one. So the idea behind the internalization strategy is that precisely because these motivations are not about self-interest, it's not about what's good for me, it's about what's right or wrong. It's a remarkable fact that it's even possible for an animal to be motivated this way, but it is. I mean, there's an explanation. It's not a mystery. It's just a remarkable fact. But what I'm saying is, since humans happen to have this remarkable ability to be intrinsically motivated to do something just because it's right, we should harness that. We should use that. And that's what the internalization strategy is. And that's not what the instrumentalist strategy does. The instrumentalist strategy bypasses the psychology of norms and just does not make use of the fact that we can be motivated intrinsically. It frames everything more in terms of what's good for you, incentives and rewards, and it does not frame things in terms of what's right or wrong. So it's just not activating the psychology of intrinsic motivation for norms. Okay. So what I'm trying to do here is ease my way in by comparison to what is the internalization strategy and how does it work. I'm not trying to defend it against the instrumentalist strategy. I just want to be as clear about that as I can right up front. We just need to do both of these things as much as we can and as hard as we can. That's what I think. Again, I'm trying to turn up all the dials of motivation all at once, essentially. So we need to do both. But in practice, I really am only seeing the instrumentalist strategy happening much, I think. And here's the kind of example of that, like the Inflation Reduction Act that just came out and was a huge win in a lot of ways for sustainability goals and environmental goals. But the way that thing works is it funds a bunch of carrots and sticks. It funds a bunch of enforcement, a bunch of applying rewards and applying punishments. It does not fund a bunch of like cultural programs that are aimed to really sort of get into the minds of children or adults, anybody, and make them intrinsically care about sustainability. It's framing sustainability as a kind of economic transaction, which you can do that and it kind of works, but it also works in this other way and we're not doing that. And in fact, these things can kind of maybe even fight with each other. There's some concern about that, but I'm not really worried about that. I just want to see some internalization strategy happening somewhere. So basically my point is only that we also need to be doing this internalization thing. And then I just kind of want to try to sketch out for you what that looks like, what that would be, and give you a little more detail on what is the difference between the two strategies. Okay, and then before I go any further, I just want to have a little time out here. I've made this claim. Only the instrumentalist strategy is being pursued. That's what it looks like to me. I wonder if that's true or if I'm just like missing it or I don't see it or I just don't know very much about what everybody's doing. I feel like this is a hard, my point is, from my own perspective, anecdotally, it feels like we're not doing much with the internalization strategy. And I would like to throw it out there. If you guys think I'm wrong about that, I would love to know where. Specifically, why am I wrong? Like where do you see something more like a cultural channel being pushed and something more like intrinsic motivations being targeted and not just rewards and punishments? Okay. So now what I want to do is go into more detail to sketch out for you in more detail what is the internalization strategy, what are the kind of interventions that I'm talking about. And to do that, let me just get some terminology and background out. First, let me say what I mean by norms. I'm here for sabbatical working on a book on norms. So this definition is part of a bigger project that's not about sustainability per se. One chapter of that book, though, is about sustainability. It's this, what I'm talking about right now. So this norms definition comes from that larger project on norms in general. And it's a behavioral definition, which is to say it describes the behavior of norms without talking about the mental states involved. And that's important for a couple of reasons, but the really important reason is that you don't want to define the things you're trying to explain using the same concepts that you're going to use to explain them. You want to first define what you want to explain and then explain it. And if you're doing psychology, then the thing to be explained is behavior, what's observable. And the thing doing the explaining are the internal mental states. Psychological states are part of the explanation, not part of the thing being explained. So you need to define what you're going to explain as behavior first. And that's what this definition does. And so what I'm doing is saying it's shared practices of third-party enforcement. So third-party enforcement is a special kind of enforcement. The main motivation for this is just this point that I want to, we're going to talk a lot. We need science to do the work of filling in, well, what are the mental states that explain this behavior? But we don't want to start doing that until we have a good definition to be explaining in the first place. And this is a definition that I would defend. By third-party enforcement, easiest way I think to think about this is to distinguish it from second-party enforcement, which is just two people have a conflict and by force, I'm gonna make you do what I want you to do. And it doesn't have to be two people. Lots of animals do second-party enforcement because that's, again, it's just basically using force in conflict. Second-party enforcement is pretty boring in that way. Third-party enforcement is when you get involved in somebody else's conflict. It's not really even about you, and yet you're gonna get in it anyway. And the interesting thing to notice is that no animal has any reason to do that, really. I mean, maybe chimpanzees could get in situations where you could do that. Actually, ants and bees, I think, maybe really do have norms, and that would be an interesting thing to talk about from a different angle. But wolves don't get involved in each other's, in other people, other individuals' conflicts. They do second-party enforcement. Chimpanzees do second-party enforcement. You can get super sophisticated forms of second-party enforcement out of chimpanzees where alphas are enforcing somebody else, what looks like a conflict between two others, and it really looks like third-party conflict. But if you look closely, it's really just the alpha sort of cementing alpha status. So third-party enforcement would be, instead of, let's just compare how you do dominance hierarchies in wolves versus dominance hierarchies in humans. In wolves, the second party version of maintaining, this is the alpha, this is the king, is I'm the alpha, nobody gets to challenge me, I'm gonna enforce that on everybody, but I do it myself, I'm the alpha. In humans, it doesn't work like that, right? You're the king. Somebody says you're a jerk. You don't go enforce your status on them. You just tell someone else to go do it. You don't even do that. Somebody else just says, hey, you can't say that about the king. And they're gonna go enforce your alpha status for you. You don't even have to do it because they're norms of status. We have status norms. And against the background of human psychology, it's wrong to call the king a jerk. You don't get to do that. You can't do that. And so against the background of a norm like that, a status norm that uses a norm to enforce status, you'll get third-party enforcement of the king's status, and it'll be shared. In animals, in chimps, what you get is second-party enforcement, and it's not shared. The alpha is doing it all by themselves. I'm just using these norms as a way of sketching out the difference between second-party and third-party enforcement, and just sort of illustrate what's happening here is that norms are the enforcements of, no, that is objectively right or wrong, rather than I don't like it. That's, if you want to think of the third party part, that's really the work that it's doing, is that it's we're going to get involved in conflicts where the issue is that it just is wrong objectively in a third personal way, rather than I'm going to get involved because I don't like it in a first personal, sort of way. Okay. All right, and then just back to this same slide you've already seen, just reminding you we've got these two different types of motivation. Now the point I want to make is this. When I did this slide the first time, I was talking about why people follow norms. A really important thing, though, that we cannot just leave out is that all of this is also true for motivations to enforce norms on others. The motivation to follow a norm is, psychologically speaking, totally different from a motivation to make someone else follow a norm. Those are just really different things. But when I'm talking about intrinsic motivations here, I'm talking about intrinsic motivations both to follow the norm yourself and to make other people do it. The following norm motivations and the enforcement norm motivations come together basically as a package deal. And that's why I'm using the term internalization, because internalization is the process where both of those things come together. So you're talking about intrinsic motivations to follow norms and intrinsic motivations to make other people follow those norms. And sort of all at once in a cultural learning process, you get all of those things in one package. And that's what I mean by internalization. It's widely recognized across the social science community that this happens. But it's shocking to me how little we know about the details of how it happens and like exactly why. Very little research has actually gone into, but exactly how do we internalize norms? Yet nobody really questions that it happens. This is my gloss on exactly what it means. It's the acquisition of an intrinsic motivation to follow a norm. That's me imposing my view on my analysis of what internalization really is ultimately. In the same way that I was imposing my analysis on the definition of norms. I'll also add this bit of terminology, what I call normative motivations. These are just the same things I've been talking about, intrinsic motivations to follow and enforce norms. But they're normative because the important point here is these are motivations that are about following norms. Functionally speaking, what they are for, what they evolved to do functionally was deal with norms. And that's not like any instrumental motivations for following norms. Whenever you're following norms for an instrumental motivation, the motivation itself has nothing to do with norms. It's not about norms at all. It's not about rightness or wrongness. So let me go into a little more detail here on what I mean by intrinsic motivations to follow and enforce norms, and just really separate those things out. Again, I'm trying to make it more clear what's different about the internalization strategy relative to the instrumentalist one. Okay, so first let's just stop and consider the category of intrinsic motivation per se. Not intrinsic motivations to follow norms, not intrinsic motivations that are about sustainability, but just any kind of intrinsic motivation as a general animal, as a category of animal behavior in general. So we're just talking about the basic adaptive goal, the thing that is, from the point of view of an adaptive functional analysis, the end in itself. So if you're talking about motivations of hunger, then hunger is the intrinsic motivation. Food is what you want, and you don't want food for something else. There's no further goal down there somewhere that, oh, once I've got food, now I can do X. When you're hungry, food is the thing that you're looking for. That's the thing you are intrinsically motivated for. When you're thirsty, water is the thing you're intrinsically motivated to get. When the motivation you're talking about is sexual attraction, sex is the thing you're intrinsically trying to get. If it's fear, it's avoidance of predators or avoidance of harm or of some kind. And you know, you can do this list. This is not, of course, anything like an exhaustive list. This list goes on for not forever, but really far. This is just to give you some examples. By contrast, let's just look at the whole category of instrumental motivation, not about norms, not about sustainability, just any kind of instrumental motivation. These are just your non-basic goals. These are the ones where there is some further goal down there. So it works like this, very simply. If the intrinsic motivation I have is hunger, I'm just hungry, then an instrumental motivation that would get me there is go hunting, get some food, go, you know, look for some berries or something. Likewise with thirst. If thirst is the intrinsic motivation, the instrumental motivation would be to find some water or go walk over to that water fountain or walk over to my water bottle. That would be an instrumental motivation. And it's going to work this way with everything. For any basic category of motivation, then all you're doing is walking backwards to, well, what are the specific ways that you achieve that? What are the specific instrumental means by which you get sex or by which you keep yourself from getting too hot or too cold? You build a shelter, you do a mating dance. Depending on the species you're talking about, maybe you let the alpha eat first because you're afraid of getting beaten up. If you're going the other way, if the intrinsic motivation that you're worried about is social status instead of fear, maybe you do the opposite. Maybe now it's time to challenge the alpha because you're less worried about the fear, more worried about the social status. So this is just normal motivation. And these are some non-normative examples that I was just using, talking about fear and social status. But let me change the examples up where I'm using the same intrinsic motivations and looking at different instrumental motivations, that's to say, motivations to do instrumental actions towards the intrinsic goals of fear and social status. What I'm imagining when I say a normative example, what I'm imagining here is against the background of a norm that says it's wrong to steal, you might be afraid of stealing. You might have fear. You think about stealing, you go, I don't want to get punished. No, thank you, I won't do it. That's instrumental motivation. Fear is the thing motivating you. Going the other way, maybe you want social status, and by making a donation, you can increase your social status. The intrinsic motivation is just desire to gain in status. It's not to do the right thing. But you are doing the right thing maybe, but not because it's the right thing. So the point is that these are not normative motivations, even if they lead you to follow norms. The motivations are not normative. the behavior is, then motivation's not. And that's generally the case for any instrumental motivation. But when you're talking about intrinsic motivations to follow norms, the motivation is itself normative. It's the motivation to do right and to do wrong. And again, that's a special thing. It comes along much later in evolutionary history than all the other motivations, after culture has already evolved. It's, again, a remarkable and bizarre thing that any animal can be motivated in this way, but we can, and we can explain how. And so these are the things that I'm talking about. What I'm imagining by an internalization strategy is that you're taking norms like this and putting them in the minds of individuals in a real fundamental way, that they are intrinsically motivated to reduce their carbon footprint or to conserve an ecosystem or all the ecosystems, however you spell it out. And then you work backward from that, you'll get the relevant instrumental motivations will just sort of follow. If people care, they'll find their instrumental motivations as they need to. So what's happening here, I mean, the basic idea is that for the kinds of motivations that we want, the kinds of norms that we're talking about they're always going to require costly behavior. They're pro-social norms. Not selling out the future is not something that you do for self-interest, as we said at the beginning. You do it because it's right, not because it's good for you. So what I'm trying to identify then, I'm trying to pinpoint these kinds of motivations. And in turning up the dial on the intrinsic motivations, what you're doing is turning up the ability for these motivations to compete with other motivations. I mean, the way to look at it is there are already a whole bunch of costs out there involved in trying to behave sustainably. And you've already got motivations that track all those costs. So okay, it'd be better for me to ride my bike to work, but it'll be hot if I ride my bike to work. And I don't want to ride my bike to work. I don't want to be hot and be all sweaty. And you just have the motivations that I'm talking about are going to live in sort of an ecology, a sort of psychological ecology, where they're just constantly under fire, under threat, and under competition from other self-interested motivations. So what they need to be is independent. I mean, they need to be their own type of motive that can stand on its own and respond to those self-interested motives and sort of react to them. And this is exactly what intrinsic motivations for following norms are for. That is just what they evolved to do. They evolved to make you follow the norm, even when you can't see how it's in your interest, and even maybe when it isn't in your interest. To say that it's intrinsic is to say that it really is not paying attention to the consequences. And again, there are selection histories explaining how this could happen, but that's what it is saying, is that the thing that you need to do right now, the right thing for you to do right now, is not about you. It's about some larger thing. And the picture that I've got up here is only meant to illustrate the extreme, the one end of the spectrum here. But it's important that one end of the spectrum here is so far off to one end. Look at how extreme these motivations can be. Now, I'm not saying they always are. I'm definitely not saying they easily are or automatically are. But it is possible for an internalized motivation to follow a norm to cause you to light yourself on fire and die. It'd be a painful death. They can be, in the limiting case, extremely powerful motivations, and they're obviously decoupled from self-interest. The other picture is just Socrates, the death of Socrates. And what I'm trying to evoke there, I guess, I don't even know if this is historically accurate. It's just that it's kind of a trope. We all know the general pattern of the martyr or the zealot, the person who is crazy for their cause. So crazy that they'll do these kinds of things. And then, of course, sometimes you agree with their cause and they're a hero. And sometimes you don't agree with their cause and they're crazy. That depends. I mean, from my perspective, this is just the psychology that gives you that phenomenon. Sometimes it's on your side, sometimes it's not. But what I'm talking about, I'm not really trying to get people to do this kind of thing for the sake of sustainability. I'm just trying to say that, more motivation, like that's the kind of motivation in a limiting case that you can get here. And it's the right kind of motivation, decoupled from self-interest and powerful, able to stand up to a bunch of self-interested motivations. Okay. So trying to zoom back out, reorient the maximum, the basic goal here, maximize motivation all the way around, and ASAP, as fast as possible. So then I'm pushing this internalization strategy. The basic idea is promote intrinsic motivations here, internalization of the sustainability norms. And now to get a little more detailed, I want to break that down into two pieces. What I mean by the internalization strategy, now that I've said a good bit about what internalization is, now as a strategy, the idea is it's a population level thing. What we need is to get intrinsic motivations to follow these norms into as many minds as possible. So we're trying to increase the frequency of these normative motivations. And also within each mind, we're trying to turn up the strength of each of these motivations as much as possible. So all of that is what I mean when I say the internalization strategy. And once you're kind of looking at it this way, okay, we've got a psychological capacity. We're looking at it from the population level. How do we increase the frequency? And how do we tweak its functioning? That's all my bread and butter. This is all my like background. This is like, okay, great. Now this is just what we do. We grab a good theory and start applying it. And in this case, cultural evolutionary theory, in my view, is a huge breakthrough in the last 30 years or so in social science. And this is just one of the really important implications that comes out of it. But to me, this is one really important implication that comes out of it. Cultural learning, how basically we have a psychology of culture, has gotten a good theoretical explanation in the last 20 or 30 years. What the details of cultural psychology actually are, we don't know very much about yet. I mean, my view is that we just hit upon, in like recent decades, we hit upon a really good framework for learning about cultural psychology. And now psychologists are onto it and they're working on it. They're getting started, but they're sort of just getting started. And there's an awful lot to learn. And so it's really easy to look into the theory of cultural learning and basically the evolution of culture. I mean, what's happened here is that the evolutionary perspective got brought to culture itself in two ways. One was, how can we even do culture? What is it and how did it evolve in the first place? Two, once you have culture, how does culture itself evolve? And cultural evolution addresses both of those things. Right now, I'm kind of talking about the first one. How do you even have the ability culturally to internalize any norm at all in the first place? We know we have that ability, but we don't know much about the details. But cultural evolutionary theory gives us some places to look, and not just a couple places to look. I mean, there are a whole lot. It's a rich source of hypotheses for how to make some headway here on learning about internalization. But the problem is they're all hypotheses. They haven't been tested yet. They're all just out there to be tested. And I've showed this sign to a number of audiences. I'm trying to find anybody out there, any developmental psychologists that want to get into this. I am trying to get more psychologists into the project of let's just really learn how does internalization work. There's so many questions to ask. I'm not even going to put them all in front of you, but this is slide one. This is slide two and they're all specific hypotheses. So, for example, when you're learning your norms and you're looking at your models, who you're learning from, how much do parents matter? How much do friends matter? Probably they matter in different domains, but which domains? It'd be good to know. What do you do about conflicting information versus reinforcing information when different models are giving you different things? It'd be good to know. I mean, again, specifically with regard to internalization. What about explicit teaching versus implicit inference? It's obvious that children learn all kinds of norms implicitly without anybody ever teaching them anything. My daughter was regulating on me for using my wife's coffee mug before her second birthday. And there isn't even a norm in our house about not using my wife's coffee mug. That's not even the rule, but she saw it as the rule and spontaneously was yelling at me for using the wrong mug. So children do this. They just soak up the norms around them, even when they're wrong and there isn't even a norm there. But also, of course, a lot of norm learning does take the form of explicit teaching. I mean, you do a lot of, no, don't do that. That's wrong when you're a parent. So both of those things are happening, but how much and in which domains, where? What's the role of religion? And within religion, let's just separate, for example, what would be the role of a ritual, like a really good mass, if everybody's been like, it's a powerful emotional experience. I feel like, I'm not Catholic, but I go to these masses and I'm like, I would be internalizing something right now if I really was into this. I mean, you can feel you can see how ritual is doing something, even when you're not in it. Narratives, what are the role of narratives? And I mean, I put this up here first within religion, because narratives are all over religions, but also just narratives in general. Game of Thrones has a pretty good sustainability theme. And in general, the themes of stories, the morals of stories could be these morals, these normative themes. There are all these other questions about like who are your models and how do models, your cultural models, what's the age of the model? What's the age of the model relative to the learner? What's the absolute age? How is the model genetically related to the learner? What's the status of the model? How competent in other domains is the model? I mean, the list goes on. Very specific questions, all I think in other areas of cultural learning, there's already background information saying, hey, cultural learning works this way. And internalization is cultural learning. It's a specific form of cultural learning. So all of these hypotheses that are just generally out there need to be applied for internalization specifically, and just haven't yet. But these are the kinds of things that we're talking about. And so we're talking about the channel of the internalization strategy. Again, it's not do this or else. It's look at what your religious leaders are doing. Look at what this hero in this movie did over here. Look at what the cool kids in your high school are doing. That's how the cultural learning channel on norm motivation would work. And I mean, frankly, what I wish is that somebody younger and more creative and more applied than me could just know all this and then do the actual work of how to apply it. I feel like I'm doing the best I can to just find out what we need to study. But really, the real work is going to be done in who can creatively use this and turn it into cool programs, interventions, who can actually use this information. I'm not there yet, but I'm trying to get it in front of people. So, okay, now I just want to zoom out a little more in closing and talk about some general, like broader general implications comparing the two strategies. What I'm seeing happen in the sense in which I guess I feel like all I'm seeing is the instrumentalist strategy happening all the time, and I'm not seeing anything very forceful on the internalization front. I mean, there is internalization, the internalization strategy is happening in a sense informally, in an uncoordinated way, and in a kind of low-level way by a bunch of individuals. What I'm saying is we should be doing an internalization strategy that's like coordinated and go for it and really push for it. But even if we do that, it's a really important difference between the internalization strategy and the instrumentalist strategy. That on the internalization side, you get the process going and then it goes on its own. You get it started and it runs probably even better than the instrumentalist strategy, and it runs for free on its own. On the instrumentalist side, if all you're doing is applying rewards and punishment, somebody has to pay for those. And who's really able to punish, adults for things like sustainability? It's the government. I mean, almost nobody else is really able to inflict very much punishment for things like that on governments. On individuals. We can punish children and stuff as we teach them. But so what I see is a lot of people trying to use the government to do the instrumentalist strategy, frankly. I see a lot of that and making it a very political issue. And to me, it's all just missing, well, what the instrumentalist strategy can do. It's just overlooking the instrumentalist strategy. Overlooking the internalization strategy. That strategy has less to do with enforcement, but it's much less, and it's less dependent on government. And there are two just sort of key benefits that I want to bring out of that. First, it's cheap. To the extent that norms are internalized, governments and therefore taxpayers don't have to pay for them. Again, when I say a norm, what I mean is enforcement. There's some enforcement going on, and that's going to have costs necessarily. But in the internalization strategy, it's not the government and the taxpayers that are paying those costs, and the costs aren't that high. But right now, the point is that the government doesn't have to pay them. Informal enforcement is still required. Like I was saying, you still have parents telling kids, no, don't do that. That's still enforcement and that's still punishment. But it's not economic punishment, and it's not. It doesn't cost people anything. It kind of costs the parents some time. I mean, that's what I mean by there are costs. But it's not like the costs of the instrumentalist strategy at all. You're offloading the cost to private individuals. So it's just the government's not doing it anymore. And also, those costs aren't as bad because when you're doing it this way, the kind of enforcement that you're doing is cheaper. It's widely distributed by individuals. It takes the form of a lot of attitudes and raised eyebrows and that kind of stuff, which is what people do when they're communicating their resentment for violating a norm or things like that. But it's all that stuff instead of things like, here's $1 million for a tax incentive or something. So it's cheap is one point, and it's cheaper. So it doesn't cost much to add this strategy to the instrumentalist strategy is my point. Also, it's more stable than the instrumentalist strategy. And in a way, it's really the end game. And let me explain what I mean by that. When your enforcement is going to be on the instrumentalist side, and it's just going to come from basically who has the power to enforce, apply rewards and punishments, and that's going to be the government, then what you have to have is a government that is actually effective at doing that. I mean, that means that sustainability is going to depend on the government being effective. And that's going to depend on the government in general being effective, being able to do whatever it's trying to do, and it caring about sustainability. And, in the US, we don't worry about a whole lot about things like corruption or political stability. We don't worry about the government just being able to be effective in general. But you have to worry about that in general, because the problem we're talking about is not in the US, it's in the whole world. And a lot of governments aren't just generally effective. You can't just count on some government to do the enforcement of sustainability. Even if they want to, they can't necessarily do it. Corruption, for example, could just pull it all away. Or maybe corruption isn't a problem, but they are just politically unstable. They can't get their, they can't coordinate with each other well enough to be effective in these kinds of ways. Even in the US, though, of course, right now we've got a president right now we seem to have a government that will prioritize this stuff pretty well, at least. But we can't count on that staying, and that's not stable, not yet. And what's going to make it stable would be the internalization strategy. More people actually caring intrinsically rather than just doing what other people tell them is right or wrong. That's what would make it, that's what would give us a politically stable situation. So in a sense, I mean, to me, one of the main motivations here behind the internalization strategy is that it bypasses politics and government. It's kind of the point. It goes deeper than that. And the whole point is to go below all that so that you're working on something or you're dealing with something that's not subject to the political weather. The point, it's to value the long run, right? And I'm trying to look at this from an evolutionary perspective. It's to value the long run, really value the long run, the long run, and for the whole planet globally. If that's what we're doing, governments, frankly, aren't very impressive. From an evolutionary perspective, they don't last very long. They're only kind of effective. And they can only capture, any given government can only capture a certain fraction of the population at a time. The government of India and China can do a lot of work all at once, but even that's only still a fraction of the population. And so insofar as what we're doing to pursue sustainability is an instrumentalist strategy, where we lean on a government to apply rewards and punishments, we're just capturing, fractions of the population at a time and in a sort of only partially effective way. I mean, we should do it. We should keep doing it. We should do it as hard as we can, right? I'm not saying it's bad. It's just that it's limited. There's only so much you can do. And it seems to me that in the long run, the whole point about political stability being a problem, I mean, that the bedrock here is culture, not the government. I mean, if you're really going to have sustainability goals be themselves sustainable, be themselves permanent, or work for the long run, we can't really the goal is not to get governments to be strong in enforcing these norms. It's to have a culture that enforces these norms. And I mean, the way I'm looking at it is that when the norms have been widely internalized by a lot of people, that's when we're at bedrock. A whole lot of the population actually cares intrinsically. Then these norms are actually on stable footing. Oh, I didn't explain. I wanted to add this here. Informal norms can be permanent. Think about norms like murder, or norms against stealing, or probably rape, or all just basic assault. All kinds of norms that just basically allow humans to live in the same place together so that they can work together. Those are old norms. I mean, thousands of years old. And they're universal. They're everywhere. They're the kind of thing basically no society can live without. And when I say they're permanent, I'm not messing around. I mean, I don't think norms against murder are ever going to go away in really any large part of the world. Once human societies have gotten those norms, we're always going to have them. And that's what we're looking for here. Same thing with sustainability norms, I think, and that's the goal. That's what we're shooting for. And my point is, governments enforcing norms are not like that. Norms against murder are like, I don't know, 50,000 years old. No government, any government is a blink compared to that, right? So that's what I mean about trying to get to something deeper than politics and government and go below an instrumentalist approach. And that's what I mean by bedrock, hitting bedrock. So, I mean, the slogan sort of version would be that the ultimate goal here is not to construct a government that will permanently enforce sustainability, but to construct a culture that will permanently enforce sustainability. I mean, the enforcement is not the part. It is, you need the normative, the intrinsic motivations to just be sustainable, but you also need the intrinsic motivations to keep enforcing it, because that's how people are going to keep learning it. And that's what makes it a process that doesn't stop, that carries itself forward. Okay, so yeah, on this strategy then, it's not the government has no role. If you're talking about just the internalization strategy, there is also a role for government in that strategy, but it's only in the short term. We need it now to speed up this cultural learning process, to speed up the internalization strategy, basically. It's already happening. People are already internalizing these norms, and we don't need the government to do it. But we need to do it as fast as we can, and we might as well try to make it happen faster if we have resources to do it. That's my view. That's what I mean by do the internalization strategy. So we could use help from governments all over the world in getting norms of sustainability to be widely internalized and to do it now as soon as we can. But once that's done, we don't then need government to keep it going. I mean, once the norms are there, culture will take care of itself. And we can count on the norms, like norms against murder. We don't need the government to keep people, to keep murder wrong. Murder's wrong without the government. We don't need that. And that's what we're trying to do here. The culture is really the one doing the enforcement, and the government is just a means to that deeper end. So then what you need is what we need from government and policy, formal norms, is to just keep up the instrumentalist strategy. But that won't be as hard if the population has widely internalized the norms, both because people will be doing it anyway, and they will be enforcing it on each other anyway. And the other final point that I want to close with is that if you imagine the internalization strategy, so to speak, already having succeeded, we're at a point where it's already a deeply internalized norm widely across the whole world that it's wrong to sell out the future for the past. Another thing that would happen under those circumstances is that the instrumentalist strategy itself would work better. Government enforcement would be better because you'd have political will for it. So that's to say, once you get to this goal state, normative motivations are widespread already. There's an additive effect. You've got whatever instrumental motivations you've already got, and now you're adding to that intrinsic motivations to follow this, to be more sustainable, and intrinsic motivations to make other people be more sustainable. And on top of all of that, more sustainable actors would also be more sustainable voters, or anyway, a more sustainable populace, who's going to want a government they're going to have political will for a government to enforce sustainability norms. So it's also going to make the instrumentalist strategy work better. And okay, that's all I got. So that's what I mean, the internalization strategy. And I would love to know what you guys think about this, in particular, in claims I'm making about what people are actually doing in the world. I have very little confidence in. Claims I'm making about theoretical aspects of evolution and human psychology, I have more confidence in those. So please help me get straight where you can. Thanks very much.
Awesome. Thanks, Taylor. I think we have about 10, 15 minutes for questions. I will shuttle the microphone around for folks.
Thanks, Taylor. It was really interesting. So my question has to do with maybe a slightly different use of the word norm than what you've adopted. And one way in which you can have sort of behavioral norms is that they're behavioral norms that are associated with an identity that you hold, or a group, and which then is a group-based identity. And that identity then prescribes, so in a religious community, for example, there would be behavioral norms that are associated with that religious community, right? But increasingly what we see in, especially the US, is you have identities that are strongly formed around political parties and sort of belief systems around that. And so there are then behaviors that become normative within that group. And so so I'm wondering what problems this may have for your, you know, intrinsic motivation strategy if you engage the government, and let's suppose it's the current government that is doing that motivation, to say that certain behaviors are, you know, just intrinsically right, but then these are colliding with identities. So you can imagine then that might actually, you know, if this is coming from the Biden administration, these messages are coming out, this might actually lead to hardening of norms in other identity groups and actually be counterproductive in some sense. So curious what your thoughts are.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks. Yes, absolutely. So that question is, the way I'm interpreting that kind of question is, you know, sort of what could you do about all of this in the American context? When I was saying that about trying to get below government and politics, my analysis is what happened is that norms that don't have anything to do with being a Democrat or Republican got wrapped up in a bunch of loyalty norms. And that was a disaster. And it still is a disaster. I mean, not was a disaster, that is a disaster, only in our country, right? Similar things kind of happen in other countries, but this is a really American thing, that sustainability and environmentalism and all of that just got pinned on the left. As far as I know, it's something that it's a very American thing that that we have part of our country is just really even like anti it, right? Because it got tangled up with matters of loyalty. So, I mean, I guess my primary goal here is just sort of get the right analysis so that we can get this straight. So I'm agreeing with you about what all the facts are, and I think I'm just trying to give you, yeah, here's how I fit them together from the framework that I'm having. One point that does follow from this is that, yeah, if you're already a Republican, getting the instrumentalist and the intrinsic strategy going is going to be harder. I mean, if what we need to do now is try to get people to internalize norms, and in doing so, they have to sell out their team, that's a problem. That's a problem. But to me, the right way to understand it is understand that that's what you're up against. The right way to see this is you've got a norm of sustainability and you've got a norm of loyalty. And the thing you don't want to do is put those directly in conflict with each other, right? So what I'm hoping here is that what you get out of this is an analysis that enables you to see that situation clearly, see that, you know, what you don't want to do is naively go in trying to talk about these, you know, and have, you know, Republicans internalizing norms in just the same way that Democrats do, as if there's no psychological difference. Know that there's a psychological difference, know what it is, know how to work with it, and then move on. So what I'm trying to give is a framework that allows us to pull those pieces apart so that we can see, oh, okay, when you're talking to these people, this is the kind of thing you want to do for internalization. When you're talking to these people, you're going to need to do something totally different, because this kind of signaling is going to set off all kinds of loyalty norms in this population that's not happening in this population. And you just need to know all that. So you just need a map of what the norms are for the particular people that you're looking at so that you can pull them all apart, disentangle them, target the ones you need and not target the ones you don't, et cetera.
Thank you for your talk. It was great. Yeah, I wanted to, and I know you're using a framework that's, you know, that's within the sort of psychological, you know, literature of, you know, internalization, intrinsic, but I mean, it seems to me that a lot of our social norms don't fit nicely into both those categories. I mean, and in fact, you know, I always think, you know, philosophers sort of like to talk about morality as, you know, as if it's all in this one camp. And yet most of our norms are, you know, they fall all over the place, right? So we're swimming in norms, right? And we learn them as kids, and yeah, they're sort of reinforced by others. So everything from, you know, queue up at the movie theater is a norm of ours, right? It's not a moral norm, you know, not deeply. But on the other hand, you know, we obey it, and we don't. So I guess I was sort of like put off with the motivation, because we don't really. It's not like we're just habituated for the most part, right? And so that it seems to me, if we think about these things as developing habits or developing, you know, I mean, and that's where the virtue talk of sort of like character, you know, like it becomes part of your disposition to behave in certain ways. And so the best example I was thinking of, a kind of what could be called a sustainability norm, is in my lifetime, we've gone from people used to throw things out the window of their car, right? You know, you used to go along the road and there was litter on the road, right? I mean, we don't do that anymore,
Yeah.
right? I mean, and if somebody does it, they're sort of called out for it. And again, it's not a deeply moral norm. It's not like, I don't know if there's anything intrinsically wrong, but but it is a norm of our society not to do that. That certainly fits into sustainability. And so, and it's again, it's almost become. It's not like every time I want to. I don't even think of throwing something outside the door. It's not. I mean, so it's not like
Yeah.
I'm not burning myself in. Like I'm not doing. I don't feel like I'm doing some moral stand. I'm just like I've changed my habits. And so I guess I'm not sure if that. I guess that would be an example of something that would seems to me it would go with what you're talking about, but also I guess it's thinking about motivations in some way. I mean, sometimes I do things and I think, oh, I really ought to do this. This is the right thing to do. I'm sort of making more of a mental deliberation, but I think a lot of these things are just, I'm just habituated to do the right thing or do what I think is the right thing.
Okay, yeah. Yes, right, all correct. So what you're identifying, I think, is a different reason why somebody would behave in a sustainable way. So it's not that they're motivated, it's that they're doing it out of habit instead of motivation. Is that right?
Yeah, it just seems like
That's, yeah, that would be nice too, yeah. I mean, right, that is what we want. I mean, I'm fine with that too. And insofar as we got that, okay, we're there. I would also add to that another way that you might cause people to behave more sustainably without motivating them per se is to sort of construct an environment where it's easier for them to do it, right? So my point is there are other things we can do to get more sustainable behavior out of people that aren't really about motivation. I agree about that. But I think that to do those things, we need a lot of people who are motivated to do them. So once we have the motivation, we'll start constructing an environment that makes it easier for people to do it. And to the extent that people have these intrinsic motivations, they'll build these other things in. Also, to the point about habit, I get this question a lot. I see the point of it, but the way all habit works is that habit comes out of motivation. So any kind of, when you form a habit, you've got a motivation first. And then what habit is when the cognition, the cognitive cues for that motivation become decoupled from the environment or the motivation itself. So you continue to do it even in the absence of the right sort of cognitive cues. And what's happening, so the point there is that for something to kind of become habitual, you already have to get the kind of motivations in there to make it habitual. And also, I agree that habits, I mean, insofar as people can just follow sustainable behavior out of habit, great, let's do it. Why not? I have no objection to it. But I don't think trying to make it habitual is a very useful goal in any way at all. Like if trying to make people care about it, habit will come by as a side effect. Trying to make it a habit without making people care about it does not seem like it's going to make it, not going to actually do anything, I think. Yeah. Because here's what happens. If it's only a habit and the first time somebody actually has a reason not to do it, they won't do it. You need a motivation so that when they have a reason not to, they're like, yeah, but I need to do it. It's just the right thing. You see, I mean, habit's just weak. It has no force against anything pushing back against it, so.
Really enjoyed your talk, studying storytelling and how it can impact decision making around sustainability. But Heiberlin, I thought it was interesting because Heiberlin, in Navigating Environmental Attitudes, in his book in 2012, talks about how people approach sustainability through cognitive infrastructure and technological means or fixes, and how no one's working on cognitive. And I was curious because the restrictions that you talked about, A, it's cheaper, potentially. B is the metrics for both cognitive, for the instrumental process get old and then they have to be remade, which is more overhead. But I was curious if you think that by implementing this more cognitive approach, this approach that you suggested, if it would be able to naturally change to the emergence and sustainability problems. Which,
Sorry, say that again, just say it again.
Yeah. So like the concept of a wicked problem in sustainability means that there's no panacea and it's always changing you have to address it locally, those kinds of things, right? Which is a limitation of infrastructure and technological fixes, right? So I was curious if you think that cognitive might be a little bit more flexible and be able to grow and navigate around that space, or if you think that it might run into the same barriers of the restrictions that follow with instrumental.
No, I don't think it would. It could if you did it this way. If the way you went about framing the norms that you're trying to put in people's minds was hyper local, super specific, ride your bike, and not about the globe or sustainability in the general, just ride your bike, ride your bike. If that was what was getting internalized, then you would have that problem. But you don't need to do it that way. I mean, insofar as instead you zoom out and it's just, well, anything that's bad for the future is bad, is wrong. Then it's going to, I think, automatically be domain general. So it's going to capture everything, and it should not have that same problem. If I understood the question right, yeah.
No, that was
yeah,
great.
interesting question, yeah. Yeah, no, a big part of what I'm trying to do here is that this is it's very abstract and vague, I know, but it's very general, right? Which means it can be applied in a whole lot of ways. It's got, I think, a lot of general, the problem is, how do we make it concrete? How do we get it down to the ground? Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks again for your talk. Tons of questions in my notes here, but I'm going to try to stick to one. And it primarily builds off of your answer to Jake's question. One of the goals we have here in the School of Sustainability is teaching students to develop systems thinking and understanding kind of the complexity of the systems that they work within. Building off of, I guess, your answer to Jake's questions, where you talk about perhaps the norms that we want to invest in are those that are at a higher level of prioritizing the future. For instance, I guess I worry about using norm analogies like the ones that you presented of stealing and murder, because those to me feel much more concrete than let's prioritize the future. Perhaps it's easier to give someone a simple rule of don't steal than it is to convince someone to care about a nebulous future, or what does it mean to prioritize the future versus I shouldn't kill and I shouldn't steal. And so I guess I'm wondering how an appreciation of systems thinking interacts with our norm priorities, if we need to start adding those into our IRA bills, for instance.
Okay, so yeah, I think I see how that does follow up on the question before, and sort of what you're saying is, maybe. So what I said is, well, you don't have to do it that way. That's that hyper local way, and I think maybe what you're suggesting is, well, you don't have to, but can you? You know, maybe it doesn't just come for free, and I think that's a good point. Like, so what I took your point to be is that. Maybe it's not just so easy as saying, well, hey, just all the future, just cap one general purpose norm, and we can just cover everything, which is sort of what I was doing in my answer to his question, because that general purpose norm is no longer like murder or stealing, right? It's easy to teach people something concrete like don't murder, and it's not as easy once you've made it some really vague principle to actually do the concrete work of getting it in people's minds, right? That's a good point, I think. And I actually just think you're right about that. I mean, my response to that is, yeah, good point. That what that shows you, I think, is that what you need to do is just take a practical approach. I mean, fortunately, we don't have to be hyper-local, so we're not automatically stuck with the problem that you were worried about it. You know, you get it in this domain, but then you didn't get it over here. We can, I think, find ways of sort of striking a balance, but you're right that there might also be a practical constraint on that. We don't for free just get to be like, oh, all sustainability, it's all wrong, and then it's easy. You know, you might be right that there's just more work like that. You have to find something in between where it's not zooming all the way out to something super vague like care about the future, but also not super specific like ride your bike. You got to find whatever is the appropriate middle ground there. Yeah, and that sounds like good systems thinking. That's like think about it in the system and how. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, totally.
We probably have time for one more.
All right, Chuck. It was a great talk, very stimulating. I wanted to just push you a little bit on the difference between intrinsic and instrumental, in that you suggested that in intrinsic, the individual doesn't necessarily benefit directly. However, as one of a class, as a collective, they may benefit from reducing carbon footprints through avoided tragedies and costs. And we bound that or expand that by then saying, it may not help me, but it'll help my children. Or we say, it'll help my grandchildren even better. They'll have a better world to inherit. And the youth movement today is very much about inheriting a better world. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if it helps to sort of emphasize the the instrumental value of intrinsic behavior change. And I think that's where sustainability started with the Brundtland Declaration. And so I'm not sure we're not going full circle to that.
Just sort of right at the end there, I wasn't sure what you meant when you're saying about behavior. Could you just...
Well, you brought up intergenerational responsibility as a norm, maybe like stealing and murder. I would like to make it like stealing and murder. And I think there's openings now where perhaps it could move in that direction. And part of moving in that direction is acknowledging the instrumental value of doing these things for people, maybe not yourself, but people you know, and part of the broader collective. And maybe it's the collective we need to be emphasizing.
I see. Gotcha. Yes. Okay, good. A colleague of mine is working right now on what he calls avowed norms, where and this is a psychological thing. What he's talking about is the specific class of norms that are internalized through explicit reasoning, like thinking through how it's all going to work and being like, you know what, this is the right thing to do. And you sort of internalize the norm actually in the way that philosophers, I think, imagine norms work in general. I mean, philosophers, I think, walk around thinking everybody is just rational and that this is why, like, you figure out, oh, murder is wrong, oh, lying is wrong. You think about why it's wrong. Of course, that's not actually how anything happens, but sometimes it can in certain specific cases. And so point one, don't in any way want to shut off that channel of internalization. So if the way people are going to internalize a norm is by thinking it all through and sort of seeing, well, instrumentally, I care about my future. And so, in a sort of rational means end way, this is the right thing to do. Good. Like, that's great. I am happy for that to happen as much as it does. Being sort of a psychologist and a philosopher at the same time, I have zero faith in rational argument as a way of changing people's minds for things. Like, if what you really need to do is change a lot of minds fast, rational argument is not the way to do it. So what I'm trying to do is bypass the psychology of all that and go for things that are going to work instead of getting people thinking about it and talking about it and debating it all. Because I feel like that's where we already are. We're already mired in argument about it. And I'm trying to just get past all that and go right for it. But what's actually going to change behavior? I mean, but to the extent that people are just talking about it and reasoning about it, and that is also its own route into internalization, then I'm all for it. I mean, that does happen, I think, and I'm all for that. Yeah, I'm not pushing hard for it. Yeah, right.
If somebody wants to be
Yeah, so by all means, yeah, let's wrap up, but by all means, get in touch. I would love to hear what other ideas people have, what else you're interested in, please. Nice to meet you all. Thanks very much for listening.